If you've been listening to the Business of Biotech podcast for a while now, you'll recall that Erin Harris has joined me to co-host a few episodes. Erin's my friend, colleague, and chief editor over at cellandgene.com, and she just recently launched a podcast of her own. It's aptly named Cell and Gene, the podcast. And if you're working in the cell and gene space, you should give it a listen. It's a collection of interviews with the industry and academic leaders moving the space forward. And you can find it at cellandgene.com or anywhere you listen to podcasts. Cell and Gene, the podcast. Check it out. So today on the Business of Biotech, my guest needs no introduction because he's a regular around here. When Allan Shaw walks into a room full of biotech execs, it's akin to Norm Peterson walking into Cheers. Allan, it looks like the summer's treating you pretty well. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Matt. Always great to get together, particularly in the summertime. Good time for everything.
It looks like you got a little sun over the weekend.
It rained a lot here, so I would distill it to I got a lot of sun yesterday.
Yeah, that was a good day for that for sure.
Absolutely. I mean, Mother Nature's been playing funny games on us with the rain on Memorial Day weekend and now the rain on July 4th weekend. It's probably time to cancel your plans for Labor Day.
That would be a proactive, probably wise move. On today's episode, we're going to tap into your wisdom on a topic that every new biotech leader should be concerned about on many levels: competitive differentiation. You look at competition in this industry and you can just kind of define it on so many levels. There's therapeutic competition where multiple companies are working on very similar biologic entities. There's market competition where any number of biopharma companies are working on any variety of therapies to address a common indication. There's talent competition marked by cutthroat and incestuous nature of attaining and retaining talent. There's competition for funding. And while there's a lot of funding, there's also a lot of hands out reaching for it. There's competition for attention in the press, even competition for the attention of increasingly resource constrained regulatory agencies. So, Allan, I just rattled off a whole bunch of different, entry points into this discussion. I don't know whether you want to pick one or whether you want to kind of readjust my frame and tell me what does competition look like from your perspective?
It's a deep question, and you did a really nice job of trying to kind of call out the different considerations or the different elements or work streams or pieces that one gets evaluated on. And particularly, I think it's even more complicated these days, given the proliferation of companies that we've seen and the formation of companies. It's just been an incredible parade. And that's evidenced by the IPOs, which, every day is breaking another record. So with that said, I would say that there's probably a couple of tenets that I would offer up to kind of set a little bit of a backdrop as we trying to drill into this a little bit. I would certainly start off with that, first and foremost, time is the enemy and the opportunity is now. And I generally kind of think about it as the shortest distance between 2 points is a shortcut. Given that, you got to look out beyond your four walls and figure out the easiest way to get done. And you need to understand, what your strengths and what your weaknesses are, and be aware of the threats and opportunities that these all offer to you at the end of the day. Since some of us, all learned about SWOTs, but it's a little bit about that and really and taking a hard intellectual, objective look at all these considerations. And then there's also the competitive dynamics, that there's, generally speaking, an insatiable demand for innovative assets relative to supply. So, that's actually very powerful, because if you can tap into that and position yourself accordingly, you're well on your way. I think there's two general emotions that people respond to, and that's greed and fear. And, you wanted to differentiate, to kind of correlate to the greed, that this is, the best thing since sliced bread. And on the other hand, the fear of missing out on this when you have the opportunity now. So, those would be a couple of the general tenets. And then, going further, peeling the onion a little bit, I would putting fundamental considerations aside, critical fundamental considerations such as the science and, most importantly, data. I would put focus and emphasis on human resources, development and regulatory strategy, commercial considerations and strategy around that. I would then kind of turn that focus further down on low-hanging fruit and opportunities for differentiation based upon that. Again, putting the science and the fundamentals aside, I think human resources is fundamental. I'd always pick jockeys over superior assets, and, the jockeys will figure it out at the end of the day. And given the huge capital market run and industry growth, human resources has actually supplanted financial resources as the most significant gating factor for successful execution and value creation. And that is really one of the most underappreciated aspects. I haven't checked the prospectus recently, but it should probably be going in there now that we may not have the ability to attract the talent that we need to be successful and execute.
Yeah.
It is a scarce resource, and it's pressing the need for experienced leadership capable of operating in a changing healthcare environment and creating differentiated strategies necessary for success. If you don't have if it's getting into a car, if you don't know where you're going, you're never going to get there. You need a map, you need a strategy. And if there's obstacles, you need to figure out how to get around that. If there's accidents, I guess you need a business ways.
Yeah. And a good driver. I mean, that plays to the HR comment that you made. And I think, you mentioned it's an underappreciated asset. I think, especially as it relates to advanced therapies like cell and gene, I mean, the conversation that people want to have with us at Bioprocess Online and with my colleague Aaron Harris over at Cell and Gene, the conversation that so many people want to have with us now is around HR and the talent crunch and the competition for talent, especially, as I said, as it relates to those advanced therapies. So I think it is becoming more appreciated in its scarcity. I mean, that would be my reflection on it. It's becoming more appreciated just how valuable that is as a differentiator, because it's so scarce. You've got a lot of experience working with biopharma companies that are in the formative years. What advice do you have around, or thoughts do you have around how to build HR in to the secret sauce as a competitive differentiator? How to build talent in? I mean, it's a difficult proposition because it's limited.
You're right. No, it is. And it's not just about recruiting folks. It's about retaining folks. It's probably more costly to lose somebody and retain them. So, you should consider that as you're thinking about, the way of building the right hooks and tentacles. And certainly because of demand, I think certainly being aware of the market and what the market dynamics are, because if you're not going to be competitive from a comp, from an equity, long-term, short-term perspective, that's a lot to overcome to start with. And then I think there's cultural issues too. And I think even now workforce and what you're focused on is, do you need to be in the office, or are you not in the office? There seems to be a little bit of a pushback on coming back into the office. I think, senior managers and leadership are thinking that maybe that it's better to have people in the office. I don't think people are embracing that. I think they're considering what their options are. I think that, and what I would call out is hypocrisy, because on the board level, the boards are looking at a very much of a hybrid approach. Right. So, if you can't do it at a board level, it all starts with leadership. It transcends the culture. And I think culture is going to become an important element to it, because people are going to be able to have choices, particularly when you have this supply and demand imbalance. And this situation has become even more acute with, as I mentioned, this proliferation of company formation and the parade of IPOs. As our mutual friend Rob Wright calls it, it's the boy bands of biotech, reflecting this rapid pace of company formation. You try to put your script together and it begs questions. Are you building a company for the market? Are you building a company durably? Or are you building a company just to flip?
Right. Well, that brings an important, an important sort of philosophical point up that I'm curious about your response to. So, you talk about this parade of IPOs and the boy band. What does Rob call it? The boy band?
The boy bands of biotech.
Yeah. Okay.
I love it.
Yeah. There's I guess there are two planes we could have this conversation on, right? One being like super, super early, maybe the competitive differentiation is perception. Maybe what you're doing to create competitive differentiation has to do with more with perception than reality, more perception than science or data or meat, right? Of the therapeutic. And then later when there is more established, more established and more close to a product, competitive differentiation takes on a different meaning. It's got a different approach. So hopefully you're following along with what I'm saying here. But like in these early, very, very early stages, like is there a point where it's maybe too soon to put a stake in the ground or plant the flag around your competitive differentiator? Is it just bluster to get some attention?
At the beginning, I think it's arguably easier because you're selling the dream. Anything is possible early on. I mean, the question, is it plausible? And you need to have the plausibility there to be able to stake it out. But I don't think there's ever too early to carve out your vision. I mean, look, protein degradation, for instance, right? That was a plausible theory, but it's just now starting to really be validated with real human data. So, but you need to have a credible story around it. And I think that's then gets into, once you have your vision, how are you developing it? How are you de-risking it? And that one, I think, really separates the strength, that's Darwinism, separating the weak from the strong, and I think the developmental strategy is really joined at the hip with commercial. You need to understand something that's relevant, right? There's so many times when you talk to young companies where they're developing something that's very interesting, but where does this fit at the end of the day? And I think you need to be mindful of the very competitive landscape, because this informs, what's relevant and what isn't relevant. And then the other thing is, and I think you can look at the checkpoints, right? There's an increasing prevalence of clustering of innovative activities around common targets and reflecting capital inefficiency. And unfortunately, with 14 approved checkpoints now, I don't have enough fingers to count them anymore. And going, they've actually are commoditizing brilliant science. So, which is good for patients, in fact, but, as for the business of biotech, you're cannibalizing really, really good science. It does create business opportunities on the combination, because it's really going to be the combination at the end of the day that's going to grow huge market. So I would really say that getting your arms around that also really has this huge impact on resource allocation and focusing on what moves the chains versus what's not going to move the chains. And getting back into the analogy of the map, I think, too many times people kick off the fact that you need a target product profile. You need to understand what you're developing. You need to know what you're rowing towards. And a lot of times without that, it's really hard to develop, what are you trying? What are the questions that you need to answer? Right. You can do it later on, but you haven't done the work to be able to answer those questions. And then we haven't even touched about, now that the value proposition isn't only just about the clinical data, it's also about the economic data, right? It's the whole body of work. So there's a lot of different elements that go in there. So that's why I think it's almost easier at the beginning to selling the vision and the dream, but you need to have a plan.
Yeah, but I'm still hung up though on this concept of like you're right. You're selling. I understand what you're saying. Early on, you sell the dream, but we've seen examples of companies who've sort of taken that too far too early, right? Like wild claims about too far in advance of proven data or blatant spin, inflation of data. At least I see it, and perhaps that's a result of the seat that I sit in, right? I mean, anybody who's an editor of a trade publication in the space is exposed to the PR and IR machine. Perhaps sometimes that machine is a little bit over revved. What's your advice though for companies to safeguard from taking those flyers, right? Like making those stretches too soon, too early. At the same time, acknowledging that, you've got to maintain the momentum and the energy and the morale. I get that, but how do you keep it from going too far?
Nah, that's a great question. Really is. And it really cuts to the heart of it because it's all about balance. And you need to find the right balance. You need to answer questions. Why does somebody want to invest in us? Why should anyone care about us? And then the other thing you need to answer is why now? Why can't I just come back to you in a year? Mm-hmm. So there's some real tensions in the whole dialogue on what you need to do. And at the end of the day, your credibility is priceless, right? You can't put a price tag on that, and you can't buy it back. And that's important. And I would generally suggest don't get too much in front of your skis. Mm-hmm. If you do, it's generally winds up generally not a good outcome. Life is simply too short. And it's almost impossible to replace and remediate credibility once it's lost. So, I think you got to have a moral compass. I mean, not to say that people are immoral, but I think you got to understand, the boundaries of gray and navigate. I mean, life is about navigating gray, and this is no different than that at the end of the day. I think there's a lot of hypothesis out there, and there's a lot of hypothesis on hypothesis. And I think that there's ways you can ground that out and validate that. Regular meetings with the FDA provides credibility in terms of your timelines, the feedback, how you're designing your studies. I think, being able to articulate why you're doing studies and running the killer experiments, and that you're using the right animal assays. Because at the end of the day, how many times do we see tests that work wonderful in the preclinic in animals that don't translate? So it's about using the right studies and answering the right questions. A lot of times people keep these things going because they don't want to know the answers. If they have the answers, they are out of a job. Right.
Sure. Like that's the point I'm making. Like if you got these companies that, perhaps you talk about credibility, I can point to a whole host of incredibly credible fundraisers, but at some point that credibility has to parlay from our ability to keep the company moving from an economic standpoint to having a leg to stand on from a therapeutics development standpoint, right?
No, you're absolutely right. Ultimately, you can package yourself, you can dance, you can sing, you can promise people cures, but at the end of the day, there's no getting around it. Show us the data, show me the data, right? And, there's a great quote from Edwards Deming, and it's this: "In God we trust, all others must bring data."
Yeah. I've heard that before, and I like it. I like that. Yeah.
So, I think you got to ground it out, and, you ground it out differently. There's different ways of validation too, right? jockeys, going back to jockeys, people who've done it, seen it, that helps validate things. I mean, you can look at people's success in the capital markets and raising capital. Generally, the ones that have do it successfully have done it multiple times. There's trust. They've made money for people, and that's not inconsequential. So, getting a rock star, getting someone who's seen it, done it before, that those are fundamental. Institutions in your cap table provide credibility. You have the fundamental investors. That's what we're seeing right now with the boy bands. The parade out there, and these things become somewhat self-fulfilling in many respects. So there's a little bit of a lemming mentality that follows suit on that, but that is a competitive advantage. If you've got those folks in your cap table, you're going to have a lower cost of capital. You're going to have easier access to capital. There's no question about it, and that transcends to the validation of your science, because there's a presumption that these guys have kicked the tires and they've bought into it. So that those are all pieces of the equation at the end of the day that grounds it out. I mean, look at Moderna. I mean, I think there was nothing shy about the way Moderna approached their existence. They were demonstrative as a private company, and they've been able to back that up to date.
Yeah. You talked about, there's maybe some more nuance to your references around your capital partnerships being more nuanced examples of creating competitive differentiation. And you referenced earlier, the crowded checkpoints landscape. What's your advice to companies that are in a space like that that's a bit crowded, whether it's crowded therapeutically or crowded from an indication standpoint? What are your opinions around sort of creating some more nuanced value propositions or competitive differentiators? That is where there appear to be a whole bunch of me too companies. What can I do? Is it, perhaps partnership is a good example. You mentioned partnership earlier. There's competitive differentiation, perhaps in who you associate yourself with, who you align with from a combination standpoint, who you choose as a partner. What other examples are there out there for that kind of differentiation?
No, it's a fantastic question, and it really speaks to where I think a lot of people are, right? Look at all the different TNF inhibitors. Look at the checkpoints. Some knowingly were fast followers, and others just going back to lemmings, and people thinking that you need to have that in order to reduce your costs for combinations. So it depends on your relative strategies around that. But to your point, I think you need to develop strategies around, I guess this all actually, let's taking a step back, really provides an opportunity if you view it as an opportunity as opposed to a challenge. And I think areas that can allow you to have a bit market advantage are right in your face. And it's really how you think about it, developing strategies surrounding clinical, to your point, some of these things are very costly intensive. So you may want to partner around somebody to be able to scale them up and to be able to answer different questions and to be able to open the market up a little bit. So that's certainly an approach. You can also go for areas that people haven't been to before. That's been time tested. When you look at the different indications, whether it's Regeneron or whoever else who's been later to the party, they've picked indications that allow them to get to the market quicker. And it's kind of akin to what Phil Needleman said in his 10 Commandments of drug R&D. Find the shortest route to heaven. Figure out how you get your drug out there. Don't spend 80,000 years doing discovery experiments. Do the ones that you need to do, and then quickly bring the drug to market. Then you open it up and you figure out different areas to I wouldn't call exploit, but to serve patients' needs and see where the opportunities are. Additionally, I would say besides the clinic, I think there's commercial strategies that you can take, regulatory strategies you can take in terms of, again, bringing things to market quicker, and look for opportunities to differentiate yourself, whether or not it's a fast track status or whatever the approach might be. And again, those going back to Phil Needleman, those smaller indications, you may be able to do this with a phase 2 registration study too. So there's, again, different approaches to deal with what I would call, as you call the nuances. But I think it's really also staying focused on your core expertise, right? What got you there? What are you good at? And are you better at this than other people? And is there an angle there? I think that's really important in terms of being able to leverage that therapeutic footprint and to be able to maximize the asset value. Because really knowing where you're good at also, by definition, lets you identify where you're not so good at. And you can identify the gaps to be able to leverage the vast ecosystem. It doesn't have to be made here. You don't have to recreate the wheel. Going back to my earlier comment, the shortest distance between 2 points is a shortcut. Collaborate, and collaborate whenever possible.
Yeah. Yeah. You brought up an interesting point around the regulatory landscape and a strategic means of leveraging the regulatory space as a competitive differentiator. And I guess I hadn't thought of it in that respect. The FDA does give you avenues. I mean, they create avenues to kind of take the shortcut, if you will. I know that's probably a bad word to use.
Yeah, we probably should drop using that after today.
Yeah. In the context of FDA, not a good idea to use that. But in the context of how you're using it, those avenues are there. How do you know when it's appropriate to kind of choose one of those paths? Any thoughts on that? Like, when do we say, hey, maybe we need to seek this avenue that the FDA provides? And the other question that occurs to me is, how do you know that it is truly a differentiator if you go down one of these paths? Is there a source where I can kind of look and say, well, if I take this, if I chart this course with FDA, I know that I'm not the fourth company in my space to do it. Maybe I'm the first. I don't know. Is there a resource to know that?
All fair points. What the FDA does for other companies is generally, if they give them a fast track designation, I believe that's in the domain. But I think I would back up and think about who you need to be, in your foxhole. What are the resources you need on your table? And, I think to go through drug development without having a regulatory resource as part of your think tank in terms of the way you're approaching drug development, I think you're missing a critical element to that. People know what they know and they don't know what they don't know. And I think having somebody plugged in on a regulatory side, again, I don't think all regulatory advisors are created equal. I prefer to take advice from people who've actually been involved with getting drugs approved before, and have a resume behind all of that. I don't want somebody learning on my watch. And when you see hypothesis on a hypothesis and you hear people pontificating about timelines that make no plausible sense, and it just reveals that they're not conferring with people. So I think it's part of drug development. You need to understand what are your dials that you have at a regulatory perspective, and it comes back to time to market and speed. And there's benchmarks out there too. I think responsive to your question too, that actually demonstrates the value of this. You have these vouchers, that you get if if it's a pediatric drug, and they get traded. And they've been traded for over $100 million. Big dollars. Yeah. So, there's real, that quantifies the speed to market valuation and what people are going to pay for, particularly when you get into a space race, as you allude to, right? I mean, we saw numbers when it turned out the product has been a problem to date, at least in the form of an antibody. But, the PCK9 drugs, right? I believe, if I got it right, I think Amgen paid a small fortune to get a voucher, priority review voucher, to be able to bring it to market. So, there's numerous examples of that.
The Business of Biotech is brought to you in partnership with Cytiva. Together, we're committed to helping the leaders of new and emerging biopharma companies navigate the financial, organizational, human resources, and regulatory waters you'll encounter on your way from discovery to the clinic and beyond. Check out a host of useful resources for biotech leaders at Cytiva's Emerging Biotech Accelerator at cytivalifesciences.com/emerging biotech. That's CYTIVA lifesciences.com/emerging biotech. Your point about who's in your foxhole, the regulatory thing, and I know this goes back to HR as a differentiator and talent as a differentiator, but I'm curious about this, and I think other people would be too. I've never worked in a biopharma company. I've never, been in the C-suite of a biopharma company and worked with, a chief financial officer and a chief of regulatory affairs and a chief medical officer and so on and so forth. From your perspective, when you assemble that team, and we know you want you want folks who have been there and done that, who have traveled that path before. But when you assemble that team, is it assumed that each of those roles will come into the organization knowing full well that they're not just there to, do the medicine as a CMO or do the travel the regulatory framework as a chief regulatory officer, or build, the facility or the manufacturing scheme as a chief technology officer? Is it assumed that when they come in, they recognize that their role includes that of chief differentiator within the context of their job? Or is that trained? Or is that, part of the culture that you have to build? I'm just curious, because, I've never been there, but I wonder how many of those folks come into the role recognizing that there's an expectation as a growing company that you play a role in this differentiation effort, a palpable role.
It's a provocative question. It's not one that I've actually thought about. Does this person get it?
Yeah, well, I mean, I feel like it's legitimate because, the other part of the conversation, to just add context to the question, I spend a lot of time talking with execs who are hung up on the translation from academia to commercial, not just in terms of science and medicine, but in terms of people, right? I certainly wouldn't make the assumption that, a recent MD graduate coming out of school is going to step into a biopharmaceutical role knowing full well that there's an expectation that they contribute in a tangible way to the competitive differentiation of the company. Maybe the veterans have been grizzled to know that, but
I think that's I think you kind of maybe have answered the question a little bit with what you just said. I think it depends. And I think, the less experience, there's no substitute for experience. And, like I said, I never considered whether people actually thought about it. But as I reflect on this, the people who've seen it, done it, they're much more attuned to what it takes to be successful. And typically you could be you need to be differentiated. But I'd also point out that, Big Pharma survived and survived very handsomely without having to be different, right? Mm-hmm. You got numerous TNF drugs out there. We do have a lot of fast followers. And I think that's going to be, that has worked in the past because we've had a tolerant healthcare system that allowed it to work. I think as the aging population gets older, I think there's a breaking point in terms of what we can support from a healthcare perspective. So I have a personal view is that drug pricing is going to fall into two camps. For Me Too products, even if there's IP on it, it's going to still be coming down to like you see in Europe with reference pricing, and it's going to be branded generics for all intents and purposes, things that are novel, things that are innovative. That's going to continue to get premium pricing, and that's part of the machine that we have. You need that to happen in order to be able to inspire the entrepreneurial and competitivism. And when you look abroad, the ecosystems are not what we have here, and that's something that's actually working. So for all the things you can pick at and complain about, we are promoting innovation right now, and you got to be careful that you don't do anything to hurt that.
Right. Yeah. Hamper that effort. Yeah. I want to get your perspective on stakeholders and getting their attention as it relates to communicating your competitive differentiators. And there are some obvious ones, right? I mean, early in the game when we're looking for venture capital, when we're pitching investors, we've actually recorded episodes on that, Allan, very specific to how to go out there and raise funds as a brand new entity. And that speaks to this, you've got to have a competitive differentiator to establish the differences between your company and myriad others of those, pre-boy band, right? Like the prepubescent boy band players that haven't even made it that far yet. But who are some of the other? I guess one. Who else is part of the audience that you want to differentiate yourself in front of, and what are some good approaches to communicating that differentiation?
I think you first have to start out with, or who are you communicating to, right? Because the messages can be different too. And, I'm not sure always one size fits all. You'd like to make them be one size fits all. But I think you got to be mindful of that. You're going for institutional investors, you're going for retail investors, or you're going to industry people and medical affairs. So you got to really understand what your audience is. And then I think you need to also, develop key messages that incorporates all forms of communication, like shareholders letters, investor corporate presentations, the website, social media, public relations, interviews. And it's important to really stay on those messages. And those messages need to be, constantly, reviewed and updated. But, it's important, even if somebody asks you a question that you don't like, you got to respond with your message. And if your message is, I love my mommy, they say, why did you have such a bad quarter? I love my mommy. It just has to be the ultimate response at the end of the day. And you got to stay on point. And I think you also got to be mindful of the fact, at least from my experience, that people generally do a very horrible job of listening. I think listening is one of the most underappreciated art forms. And if you're not listening, it really makes it hard for them to retain the information. So it's important to be redundant and always on message, like I said. It's like detailing. It's about reach and frequency. And, I find you got to say it at the beginning, you got to say it at the middle, and you got to say it at the end. And they're only going to remember 20% of it anyway, which is the frustrating thing. But at least you're keeping it on point, you're keeping it there. And I think that helps in terms of the communication. But it comes back to data. You can come up with a great story, you can impress them. But again, you got to answer why now. Why are you relevant? And I think being relevant and thinking of ways to remain relevant are equally important. And it could be around competitive landscape. It can be around certain particular conferences and events. But, I kid that if you want to get hit by a car, you have to be in traffic. So, you do need to be out there a little bit and be mindful that there's no silver bullet. And it's really just a lot of tactical error, things that you need to do and continually to do it at the end of the day. And then success breeds success.
Yeah. Is that consistency, the tactical consistency, something that you see as a failure point? I mean, what I don't want to put words in your mouth or make assumptions. What are failure points around creating competitive differentiation? Where have you seen companies kind of fall flat on their face or do it wrong?
I've seen companies, I mean, you may not believe this, but companies that, you go into a meeting and they don't understand the clinical landscape for what their targets are. Mm-hmm. To me, the meeting should end pretty quickly after that. So, you need to know your business and you need to know things and you need to be aware of things. I think that, that I'd say that's how you unfavorably differentiate yourself, right? I mean, some of this is not about just differentiating yourself. It's not about putting yourself out with the garbage.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's where I, bring the conversation, maybe not full circle, but tie back to a key point here. Making sure you don't end up taking yourself out with the garbage. That's very dependent on firm leadership, the folks in the foxhole, right, who have seen that happen before and know how to avoid it.
Oh, I know, absolutely, and you got to also be committed to your vision and have conviction. I don't think it's helpful to pander to investors. I've seen that happen too often where they'll say, well, you need more in your pipeline, or what about this? I think you're going down a very slippery slope when one does that. To me, the bottom line is it's important to run your business unbridled by the industry hubris. While there are no guarantees, particularly given the inherent industry risks, capital efficient organizations and stakeholders, including patients, will be rewarded for cost-effective development and accelerated time to market. And I think if you have your conviction and you're building for the long haul, there could be interlopers. And I think going back to team, I think a great way to understand where this company stands and its conviction to execution, differentiation, and winning is their team. If you got a middling team, you're never going to execute, and you're never going to be able to answer the important questions. So I think that is the biggest differentiator, and people kind of try to be cheap around it. They try to, and in this marketplace, I don't think you can afford to dither on these things. You want to get the right people on board, and it's about fit too, right? And it's a dynamic market, but I think you need the right people. If you can't do it yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. And on the next episode with Allan Shaw, we'll delve into the wrong people. We'll name names on who's cheaping out on their people. We're not really going to do that. That was just a shameless attempt to get some attention.
You got mine.
As Allan frantically shakes his head, no, we're not going to do that. Oh, what haven't I asked you, Allan, around competitive differentiation? And value proposition communication? What haven't I tackled here that you wanted to share?
I think we've gone through a lot. Probably the one area that we didn't really touch on, which I think is going to be an important area for people. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's two areas. I think one is you got to be intellectually honest. Mm-hmm. I think you got to be in touch with both your masculine side and feminine side, or in other words, know your strengths and your weaknesses. We've touched on that before, but I can't say that enough. And I think that really informs resource allocation. You need to leverage, your capabilities, understand the shortest distance, be mindful of what other people are doing, and try to differentiate yourself in terms of your target selection and your methodology for development. And that feeds into the resource. One size doesn't fit all. There's different strategies for different goals. If you want to buy a company, but you only want the lead program, would you buy a cow if you only wanted to buy a steak? So you figure out best ways of going about it. I think in my view, resource allocation is alive, it's living, and it has to be reevaluated. And I would recommend doing that at least on a quarterly basis, or at least annually, if nothing less than that. It's critical to be able to make business decisions based on where your priorities are. And it's important to understand that there's KOL views. You want input from all the different folks. You want a 360 perspective. You want to talk to the KOLs. You want to understand the potential indications and the regulatory pathways. What are patient advocacy groups' views on these things? They can be very helpful. And managed care. So, there are lots of different areas. You can come up with a great program, but, are we going to be able to demonstrate the right value to be reimbursed for it? It's show me the money, and it all co-depends on itself. So I think resource allocation is something that when you have a flood of cash, people are going to be a lot less vigilant with the way they do it. And I think we're probably in that environment right now. I think the markets are tapering off, and this is a really good time for people to get in touch with their masculine side and feminine side, and to tap down on the resources and look at what's the real value drivers and make sure they have enough for a rainy day. Because as we know, the clinical attrition is very high in this space. Yeah, to be able to pivot and have the financial flexibility to live another day.
Are you forecasting a little bit of a shakeout?
I guess it's something that I'm generally anxious about. The market's been going for about 10 years now by all conventional measurements. That's unprecedented. So, it's something that I am sensitive to, that, how durable that is. And I think it continues to go. Like a broken watch, it's going to have its day. I think we are seeing signs that the market's becoming much more discerning. Not everyone can go out right now. If you're looking at the way a lot of the deals are working after market, they're not working super well. Even the boy band IPOs are not working as well. Some are indeed. So from my perspective, I say the benefit of our industry and inflation, they kind of correlate. And when you have low interest rates, sign of low inflation, there's a more riskier attitude in the industry. So there's more allocation of capital, and this is all about capital flows. And I think once interest rates start to go up, we've been flooding the house and the basement with gasoline and kerosene. It's not going to take much for that to spark up. Yeah. So right now, the people are presently relaxed. That wasn't the news or view a couple of months ago, but it's something that I think all good things have to come to an end. And, I think the punch bowl will get pulled at some point. So I think you need to brace yourself for it and at least be mindful that this isn't going to continue indefinitely.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's a great reminder, and it's a great reminder that it's a fine time to, reevaluate or refocus on competitive differentiators, some of the things we've discussed today. So that come what may of the market, you've got that, those differentiations to rely on. Well, Allan, I appreciate the time. It's always great catching up with you and getting your perspective on things. And that was a great conversation.
Always enjoy it, and look forward to doing it again soon. And in between, certainly welcome the opportunity to, discuss what's happening.
Yeah, well, we'll make some plans to do that again here shortly. But in the meantime, that's my friend Allan Shaw. I'm Matt Pillar, and this is the Business of Biotech. We're produced by Bioprocess Online in partnership with Cytiva, a company that's as dedicated to serving the leaders of new and emerging biopharma as we are. Check Cytiva out at cytivalifesciences.com/emerging biotech. Check us out at bioprocessonline.com, where I would be ecstatic if you'd subscribe to my newsletter. And finally, if you like what you heard here today, subscribe to the pod, give us 5 stars, and thanks for listening.